Hello, neuroscience students. Thank you for being a good sport in taking the Respondus test multiple times. I had shared all your feedback with other professors who are having similar problems. And so I really appreciate your patience, I appreciate your diligence, and hopefully we won't run into these types of problems anymore. So we're going to start talking about the chemical control of the brain and behavior. This lecture will be split into, I think, 3 parts. The first one of these will be the hypothalamus and its function. So just briefly, what are we actually going to talk about in this whole group of lectures? Well, we're going to talk about a little bit about neural networks and going beyond neural networks. It might not seem so, but this is really what it is. So we're going to talk about neurons that talk on a very small scale, kind of an intimate setting, neurons that talk to other neurons through synaptic connections. And we're also going to talk about these very large networks that serve as kind of almost like a broadcasting way for the neurons. So you have neurons that talk to a large portion of the body, or neurons that influence the behavior of many groups of neurons within the central nervous system, such as the diffuse networks, which will be a topic of our last part of this lecture. So we're going to talk about the hypothalamus and some of its basic functions. Then we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system, which is also actually largely under the control of the hypothalamus. And then finally, we will talk about the diffuse modulatory systems. Those will be limited to the central nervous system only. Now, let's talk about what the hypothalamus actually is. So what is hypothalamus? It's that little portion of the brain that where we have lots of different tiny little groupings of neurons called the nuclei, and those nuclei have a lot of different functions. You might remember learning about the hypothalamus as this control center of the brain, the control center that controls activities largely outside of our conscious control. So the basic drives, the drive to eat or the drive to stop eating, the feeling of fullness, the drive to find water, some of the basic reflexes, such as adjusting temperature of the body in response to the changing conditions outside, adjusting acidity of the blood, or adjusting the amount of oxygen that's being delivered to the tissues. All of those are actually under the control of the hypothalamus. So all of those are autonomic regulatory activities. Okay, so this is largely a system where we have very little control. Now, the way that the hypothalamus talks to the rest of the body is through the pituitary gland. And again, you might remember some information learning that from, I think, GB2 covers the pituitary gland and how it works. So we're going to dive into this a little bit more and look at it from the central nervous system perspective. So here is a picture of the hypothalamus. This is not from your book, but I wanted to give you this, to give you a measure of how complex that particular portion of the brain actually is. So what do we have there? Well, here is the pituitary. If you recall dissecting the sheep brain, when the sheep brains were first given to you, they were encased in the dura mater and all the other meninges, and they contained the pituitary gland. Now, it was virtually impossible to dissect the brain while retaining that little stalk called the infundibulum, which connects the pituitary to the hypothalamus. But here is what it looks like in an intact brain. And of course, right in this area, we're going to have the thick layers of the meninges encasing all these structures. Now I want to point out to you the location of the optic chiasm, which I think you're aware of. And right directly above the optic chiasm is something called the supraoptic nucleus here, okay? So some of the locations are actually named because some of the nuclei in the hypothalamus are named because of their location. So this is called supraoptic because it sits right directly over the optic nerve. There's also a suprachiasmatic nucleus right here, sits directly above the optic chiasm. Okay, so this drawing is not entirely accurate. You just remember that this would lean forward just a little bit more in an actual living brain. Okay, so that's where some of the names come from. And in this picture, you can actually see what are some of the functions. The supraoptic nucleus actually deals with water balance. Okay, whereas the suprachiasmatic, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, deals with synchronizing the biological clock of our body. So that's going to talk to the pineal gland and the release of the hormones melatonin from there. So we'll talk about it a little later. Other nuclei worth mentioning is the body temperature regulator, which is the anterior hypothalamic area, then the blood pressure area, medial, preoptic. Again, these are anatomical names here. Paraventricular, which deals with water balance and stress. Others that deal with temperature and responses to temperature, the posterior hypothalamic that directs shivering. Ventromedial, which is going to contain the nucleus regulating appetite and satiety, and others that are not in this picture. Now, hypothalamus sits directly underneath the thalamus. So hypothalamus function is quite different than the thalamic function. You really can't live with an injury to the hypothalamus because of what it actually controls. It controls the very fundamental reflexes and functions of the body. So if you damage that, the animal will not be able to seek food, will not be able to promote behaviors that are related to actually feeding itself. It won't be able to look for water. It won't be able to feel thirst, so therefore it will perish. On the other hand, the thalamus, controls and coordinates the input of all the sensory and motor pathways and kind of digests that information and then transfers it back into the cortex. So the function is quite different between the thalamus and the hypothalamus, okay? And I just want to point out to you that both thalamus and hypothalamus are organized around on both sides of the third ventricle. Okay, so a large portion of it is an actually empty space that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, and that might be a little bit better illustrated right here, although I'm not sure about this, but you can look at this. So here is a brain with almost the entire frontal lobe and the frontal parts of the temporal lobes as well removed, and what's left is the inner portion of the brain where you can see the hypothalamus. Just don't forget that inside the hypothalamus is that empty space, that third ventricle. So it kind of sticks out here and you can see a little bit of the third ventricle. If you keep cutting, the empty portion will be larger and larger, and right above it is the thalamus. And right here to point out to you are the areas of the brain we just discussed. So this would be the basal ganglia, in close proximity to the hypothalamus. Another structure I want to point out to you is the amygdala. Amygdala is in a very, very close proximity and connected to the hypothalamus, and it's going to have a major effect on controlling emotions. The hypothalamus is also going to be involved in that axis. Okay, so let's talk about the secretory functions of the hypothalamus. The first of all, Let's talk about this very commonly used example of the responses to temperature. What happens when we become cold? Of course, it's not an appropriate question right now. We're pretty hot. So what happens if our body gets cold? We begin to shiver. We begin to have goosebumps, and I asked the question why here, so think about it for a moment, and our extremities begin to turn blue. What is actually happening? Well, the hypothalamus is commanding the body to selectively cut off circulation to the less important parts of our body. That would be the extremities. So we begin to turn blue while keeping the core temperature as high as possible, meaning keeping the brain and the visceral parts of our body as warm as possible and allowing it to function. Now, why do we shiver? Well, shivering is essentially this is how the hypothalamus induces muscle contractions, and muscle contraction makes us warm. We know if we start running, we're gonna be warmer. Shivering does the same thing. Goosebumps are a way of our skin to actually raise the hair. Well, it doesn't do all that much good because we're not extremely hairy, but I think back when we were hairy, could have helped. Now, the opposite happens in very high temperature. Our body begins to produce sweat, therefore trying to cool down effectively. Remember, water has a very high evaporation heat. It takes a lot of energy to evaporate water. So therefore, sweating and evaporating that sweat off of our skin removes a lot of this extra energy, heat energy, and it cools our body very effectively. We also, our skin turns pinkish red because now we would like to increase the blood flow to the extremities, so relax the smooth muscle that is constricting our arteries that are delivering blood to the extremities and allow that blood flow unimpeded. So this increased blood flow actually helps us cool down. Okay, so other things that are going to be regulated by the hypothalamus is acidity of the blood, for example. We have sensors that will sense that directly. How do we know? Well, if you start now jumping in place very quickly, what will happen is that your breathing will get faster, and this is directly in response to the increased acidity of your blood. Right, so this is going to be a feedback mechanism where chemoreceptors will actually detect that your blood is getting too acidic and will make your lungs work faster to deliver more oxygen and remove some of the CO2 that is going to make your blood acidic. So this is what's going to happen. This is also under the control of the hypothalamus. Okay, so here is another view of the hypothalamus. Now we're looking at a cross section. So we're slicing the brain a little bit. Now you can see the third ventricle right here, and you can see portions of the lateral ventricles on both sides, and you can see that the hypothalamus is really localized right around the third ventricle, and then there's this little section right here that's right above the optic nerve and the optic chiasm. Okay, so that's what we're looking from the front towards the back of the brain, and we can see that there are different zones of that we can actually see, and we'll find out that these zones have somewhat different functions within the hypothalamus. So all this tricolored area is going to be the hypothalamus here. The periventricular portion zone of the hypothalamus controls the circadian rhythms that we talked about a little, and controls the autonomous nervous system, and also this is the portion that controls the neurosecretory cells. I'm going to talk about them next. Let's look at the neurosecretory cells. So the way that the hypothalamus communicates with the body is through the pituitary gland. Right here you have a nice picture of the pituitary, and you can see that it's divided into two portions. The anterior portion and the posterior portion. Posterior towards the back, anterior towards the front. We're going to first focus on the posterior lobe of the pituitary. Look at what the arrangement of cells here. There's some large neurons. These are called magnocellular. We've learned that magno means large. Magnocellular. Those are neurosecretory cells. What are they? They're actually neurons, but they're weird neurons. They're secretory neurons. And they line this little portion of the third ventricle, this periventricular area, and those neurons will directly produce hormones and release them into the capillary bed that delivers and removes blood from the posterior portion of the pituitary. And that delivery allows the neurons to secrete the hormones directly into the bloodstream. Direct secretion. So this is the posterior pituitary secretes hormones directly into the bloodstream, and the secretory cells are neurons themselves. Therefore, these hormones are called neurohormones. Neurohormones. They are peptides, and there are two of them. One of them is oxytocin, which is known as the love hormone. So this is the hormone that is released by our brain during any kind of intimate interactions. This is the hormone that promotes social bonding, that is released in large quantities after a birth of a baby. This hormone is, by the way, released both in the mother and in the father. And this is a direct result of an interaction with the baby. Now, some little factoid that you might find interesting is that babies in the first few days after birth, they are known to have a particular scent that most people find fabulous. Newborn babies smell wonderful. Babies smell wonderful because that particular smell that they emit actually acts on our hypothalamus, and it promotes the release of oxytocin. So therefore, that little baby head that the mom or dad are smelling as they're interacting with their baby, that baby is trying to promote production of oxytocin so that the parents can quickly fall in love with the baby and take care of it and won't abandon it. So it's a really wonderful way of nature sort of taking its course. Another function of oxytocin is to promote social interactions, and in some cases of autism, findings have been made that oxytocin is not released in the appropriate amount. The second hormone that's released by the posterior pituitary, a very, very important one, is ADH. So ADH is also known as the antidiuretic hormone, and that's a hormone that regulates blood volume and salt concentration. So how does this work? Let's look at the loop and the communication. What happens here? So under conditions where there is a decrease in the blood pressure as a result of loss of blood volume, which is going to happen when we are dehydrated, ADH is released by the posterior pituitary. Okay, so this is released directly by the posterior pituitary hormones. Okay, and now this hormone is going to act on the kidneys, directly on the kidneys, and as a result of it, the kidneys are going to release something called renin, and renin is going to work on a protein that's made by liver that's normally present in the blood. This protein is called angiotensinogen. Angiotensinogen, the gen part means that it's a precursor of a hormone. The renin is going to cleave it into angiotensin 1, and then that's going to be further processed into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin II is going to work directly on the blood vessels, and the blood vessels will essentially tense. So that's why it's called angiotensin. They will tense, meaning they will decrease their diameter, increasing the blood pressure. So this is all resulting from a decrease in the blood pressure. Now, the second function of angiotensin is going to be to act on the kidneys to increase the removal of water from the urine as it is collected in the distal convoluted tubules. So this is the second thing that's going to happen. More water is going to be conserved, and the urine that's excreted is going to be much more concentrated. And then finally, the angiotensin or angiotensin II is going to influence the release of ADH from the brain, and this happens through something called subfornical organ. So the subfornical organ is one of the circumventricular organs. So those are particular ports of entry in the brain, and those are the ports of entry between the brain and the bloodstream. You know that the brain is kept behind the blood-brain barrier, but in this case, these circumventricular organs, such as this particular one, the subfornical organ, these are areas where large molecules, for example, proteins or hormones, can actually get into the brain. So this is the way where the brain communicates with the rest of the body. Okay, this is how that works. So in a way, the kidneys will control the brain, and then the brain will again control the kidneys through the ADH loop. Now, another thing that will happen in the hypothalamus as a result of this loop is that the angiotensin II is going to act on the hypothalamus to activate the hypothalamic nucleus that's responsible for the thirst response, which is simply seeking water, getting yourself ready to drink, and then drinking. Okay, so that's what's going to happen. Now, the second portion of the hypothalamus is the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary is different. There are no secretory neurons there that would secrete directly into the bloodstream. However, there are parvocellular cells. So if you recall back, parvo means they're small little neurosecretory cells. And the difference here is while the posterior pituitary releases hormones directly into the bloodstream, the anterior pituitary is sort of a very, very short range release. So these little neurosecretory cells will only release the hormones, activating hormones that can now be picked up by hormone secreting cells. Okay, so this is a very short range communication. The way this works is through something called the portal. So this is actually the hypophysiotropic hormone release, and they are released into the hypothalamo-pituitary portal. Portal is like a capillary bed here, where the releasing cells and the blood vessels are in such a close proximity that they can immediately, essentially the neurosecretory cells release their inducing peptides to induce these secreting cells, and this is a short range travel for these little hormones to now induce the actual hormone secreting cells, which are not neurons at all. So these are glandular cells. And these cells, glandular cells, under the control of the parvocellular neurons here, will now release hormones into the bloodstream. Okay, so this is a different release than from the posterior pituitary. Here in the posterior, it's the neurons releasing hormones into the bloodstream, and here the neurons talk to the glandular cells, which then release the hormones into the bloodstream. So what hormones do we have? This is the anterior pituitary, and these cells release a whole bunch of different hormones. Okay, TSH, this is thyroid stimulating hormone that will, well, stimulate thyroid. ACTH, we'll talk about that one in a little bit more detail. FSH and LH, those are the gonadotropic hormones that are influencing the gonads, so the testes and the ovaries. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH is the luteinizing hormone released in both males and females. Growth hormone, that's something that is released through the pituitary, anterior pituitary. It's needed to maintain the growth and rejuvenation of all the body tissues. So this acts on the entire body. Prolactin is used in mammals to promote lactation. That's another hormone. And then also the anterior pituitary releases endorphins, so the feel-good hormones that are released and act on the pain receptors. So let's look at the stress responses as one of the examples of how this feedback loop actually works. So the hormone that causes the release of ACTH, which is also known as corticotropin. The ACTH, the full name is adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic because it targets adrenal cortex, ACTH. That's what it stands for. So the release of this hormone is going to be under control of these parvocellular cells up in the hypothalamus that are going to secrete something called CRH, corticotropin release hormone. Okay, so these will be released into the portal circulation within the anterior pituitary, and the glandular cells there will respond by releasing ACTH. Now, ACTH is going to get in the bloodstream, and the target cells are in the cortex, so in the inner portion of the adrenal glands. Adrenal meaning it sits on top of the kidney, adrenal glands right here. Okay, so here is the cortex. The cortex is going to now produce cortisol and release it from the adrenal glands into the bloodstream. Now, cortisol is the stress hormone, the main stress hormone that is going to mobilize various forms of energy, and it's going to also suppress immunity. Now, what are the responses to the stress hormone? Well, look what's happening to all of us now. We're under severe stress with the coronavirus situation, so I suppose you would know what the stress responses are, and there are many, and we're likely to be under kind of a chronic stress for quite some time. Now there is a feedback mechanism of cortisol where it goes back into the brain and it actually influences the hypothalamus and it shuts down the production of ACTH. So this is going to again involve the circumventricular organ of the brain, which allows the cortisol to get back in the brain and be felt by the hypothalamus. Now, there are two quite famous diseases. First of those diseases is the Cushing's disease, or overproduction of ACTH. And what happens then is the person becomes kind of very red on the face. They have this round moon face, they call it. They gain weight rapidly, and they also have problems with they're immunosuppressed because they have too much cortisol. They can't sleep very well, they have memory problems, and they're very irritable. Another thing that can be looked for is this weird fat deposition on the back. It's called the buffalo hump. So if you look at the back of their neck, it's going to appear really fat, but this is really the result of the Cushing's disease. And then the flip side of it is the adrenal insufficiency, or Addison's disease. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was actually afflicted with this disease, and he required daily injections of cortisol in order to function. If you don't have enough cortisol, you're fatigued, you're dehydrated, you can actually die of vascular collapse because your blood pressure is very low. You generally lose weight, you have diarrhea, and you have all kinds of problems. So cortisol balance is extremely important. Okay, so it's one of the most important functions of the hypothalamus. Okay, we're going to end here, and then we'll pick up with the second video.